Hello, young soul. The first time I heard about the grimoire was on a muddy autumn afternoon, during coffee with my Aunt Lucia. She was never one to talk much about the past, always avoiding certain topics. But that afternoon, something felt different, as if the weight of the years had finally caught up to her, and the words she had kept secret were about to slip out. She told me she had been an ordinary woman, was not much to hold on to, until that stranger appeared in the shop. Lucia always had a small business in the city center, an antique and rare bookstore, somewhat forgotten by the locals, but for some reason, it attracted people from outside, especially those searching for something peculiar. That's when that man walked in. She couldn't say much about him, except that he was unlike any other customer. It was as if he had an aura that made him invisible to the world around him, as if no one else saw that man there, except her. He was nothing special at first glance, dressed simply and looking ordinary, but his eyes were the most disturbing part. It wasn't the gaze of a normal man, but something deeper, something that shouldn't be seen by humans. She felt he didn't belong to that place, to that time. He was the one who sought her out. And it was he who, with a cold smile, made her feel like she was being watched in a way she couldn't escape. He approached the shelf of old books, where she kept rare items, and without words, pointed to a book hidden in the shadows of the shelf. The grimoire. "This is for you," he said, his voice dragging, as if the words had been spoken by something not human. Lucia tried to refuse, but the man insisted. He offered her the grimoire in exchange for a paltry sum. She hesitated but could not resist. Something about that book drew her in, as if it had been meant for her, as if she were the only person who could touch it without suffering the consequences. She took it home that very night. As she turned the leather cover, Lucia felt the air around her freeze. The smell of aged paper was unbearable, almost nauseating. But what bothered her most were the words written on the pages. They seemed to make no sense, an ancient and disjointed language, but when she tried to read aloud, the letters began to move on their own, changing and rearranging, forming words she understood. They were not just any words. They were commands. Instructions. The grimoire was not there to be led, but to be obeyed. That book was what led her to do the unthinkable. She clearly remembers the first night she tried to follow the rituals. How she desired it with all her might, the power it promised. The hunger for something greater, something beyond what the eyes could see. What she didn't know, and what I now understand, is that there is a fine line between what can be controlled and what cannot be touched. The grimoire was not a tool for those seeking power. It was a door she should never have opened. She looked me in the eyes, and for the first time, I felt the true intensity of what she had experienced. Her words, though spoken calmly, carried the weight of a sentence. What I summoned that night should never have been awakened. That night, when Lucia decided to follow the instructions of the grimoire, she had no idea of the abyss into which she was plunging. She told me that as she lit the candles and traced the symbols on the floor, a feeling of anxiety took over her body. The air around her seemed to weigh heavily, the room growing increasingly warm, and at the same time, the shadows danced on the walls, as if contorting, writhing in a sinister choreography. She focused on the words the book instructed her to recite aloud, the strange tongue echoing in her throat, a language that seemed to belong to nobody. As the first sounds began to escape her mouth, a chill ran down her spine. The vibration coming from the words was abnormal. It was as if the words wanted to break free, as if the very air was being ripped from her lungs. When the final command was uttered, something happened. Lucia described a sound that could be mistaken for a distant roar, but it was not like thunder or anything natural. It was like the noise of something wanting to break open, something deep, something beneath the earth, from a place where souls could not escape. She looked around and saw the candles flickering, the light flashing erratically. The air grew heavy, saturated with an energy that made her feel claustrophobic, suffocated. And then, the first smell arrived. The stench of rotten flesh, of something decaying, mingled with the odor of wet earth and blood. Lucia nearly vomited, but it was the sight that paralyzed her. The candlelight began to distort, and a shadow, an immense shadow, seemingly formless, stretched across the walls. It was as if the room itself was being swallowed, as if the reality around her was being torn apart, revealing something behind her, something that should not be there. She tried to stop, tried to interrupt the ritual, but the words involuntarily flowed from her mouth, as if her own will had lost its power. The grimoire, which until that moment had been in her hands, rose from the floor with supernatural force, floating in the air. The pages turned by themselves, stopping at the last page, where an ancient symbol, made of interlinked lines and circles, appeared. That was when she saw it. On the opposite side of the room, the wall began to distort. The paint melted as if being dissolved by something invisible, and from within the wall dark, liquid shapes emerged. They were like shadows made of flesh, but no, they were not human. They had eyes, but the eyes were not eyes. They were abysses, pure darkness, and when she leapt into them, she felt as if her soul was being pulled inward, as if she was sinking into an endless sea of despair. The thing slowly crawled out of the wall. It was larger than any human, but it had no defined shape. Its limbs were elongated, grotesque, disproportionate, and from its mouth, where sharp teeth protruded, a dark saliva dripped, hitting the floor with a wet, horrible sound. The thing moved as if it were feeding on the very darkness. Lucia described fear as something tangible, something that engulfed her. She tried to scream, but couldn't. Her voice wouldn't come out. Her throat was dry, tight as if something were crushing her from within. It was at that moment she realized the fatal mistake. The book was not there to be used, but to summon them. That thing, that creature, was not an invocation. It was a summoning. The book had not been created to grant power but to open doors, to call something that lay beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The creature slowly advanced towards her, each of its movements sounding like breaking bones, as if it were assembling a living puzzle. But the most disturbing part was not its appearance. It was what it did. As it approached, she felt memories being ripped from her mind, pieces of her own life disappearing, as if the creature were feeding on her existence. When the creature was mere inches from her face, Lucia saw a glimmer in its eyes, a light that seemed pure, yet at the same time was so corrupted that it made her feel dirty, defiled. The creature spoke, and its voice was not made of words but of distant screams, the cries of thousands of lost souls. Now you belong to me. And then, what happened next, Lucia could not clearly describe. She woke up in her bed the next day, sweating, her body trembling, but nothing seemed quite right. The book was still beside her, open to the last page. The candles were extinguished, and the house felt too quiet. But something had changed. The air was denser, the sunlight dimmer, and Lucia knew she was not alone. She did not know exactly what had happened, but she felt the presence of that thing in every corner of her home. And that was when she realized it had not left her. That entity was not something that could be summoned and then vanished. It was inside her now, inside her mind, inside her memories. As the days passed, she began to see things. Shadows moving along the walls, whispers coming from empty places, and the feeling of being watched followed. But the worst of all was when she began to lose control. It was no longer just the grimoire calling her. It was the void. It was the creature that was slowly consuming her, piece by piece. She leapt at me, and in that moment I knew she was already lost. There was no turning back. He is here, Decente, she said, her voice breaking. He never leaves. Those words echoed in my mind for days. He is here. Lucia was no longer the same. The woman I once knew, with her gentle smile and welcoming demeanor, had vanished, replaced by a figure marked by obsession, by hopelessness. She revealed no more details about what happened after that ritual, but the fear she carried was palpable, thick, like a dense fog that wrapped around the words she tried to say. That's when she began to lose sleep. Every morning, her face was paler, more lined, as if the night itself had stripped something essential from her. She told me that shadows were now her only companions. No matter where she went, the emptiness was there, and the feeling of being watched was constant, almost oppressive. He never leaves, Lucia said again, in a tone of someone who had no strength left to fight against something she couldn't understand. But that wasn't the worst part of the story she revealed to me one night, when her hands were trembling and she spoke with wide eyes, as if trying to remember something crucial. I will never forget her gaze at that moment. It seemed lost, as if she were drowning within herself, and the thing she had invoked was pulling her down. She told me she felt the hands of someone touching her skin, but they were not human hands. They were cold, disproportionate, invisible claws that passed over her body, leaving a trail of pain and chills. And then came the worst part. The point where reality and nightmare merged into something indescribable. She spoke of sleep, or rather, of what was no longer sleep. When she could manage to sleep, Lucia said she was no longer alone. Something approached her in the early hours, a being that crawled through the shadows. At first, it was just low whispers, indistinguishable murmurs. Then the whispers became words, dragged out, as if someone was speaking inside her head. She didn't know what they were saying, but she knew enough to understand that whatever it was saying her name. One night, she finally managed to see what was behind those whispers. Lucia described a dark figure, larger than any human, writhing in the darkness of her room. It did not move like we do. Its movements were disjointed, as if it were gliding itself through a space that did not fit with reality. But the worst part, she told me, was the face. There was no face, only a mask. A mask made of flesh, grotesque, with disproportionately large, empty eyes devoid of pupils. She did not know if they were eyes or slits, but looking at them overwhelmed her with a sense of vertigo. She felt as if she were being swallowed by the eyes of that thing, as if her mind were slowly disintegrating, being devoured in pieces. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her body did not respond. The words echoed in her head, "Now you belong to me." The scream she could not release turned into an inner echo, reverberating deep within her soul. And then, the creature extended its hands, or rather, its claws. There were no fingers, just long, sharp tips that advanced toward her chest. Lucia felt a pressure on her heart, as if something were trying to rip it from inside her. She screamed, but heard nothing. She felt her skin burning, as if it were being touched by fire, but the heat came from within, as if her own body were becoming a vessel for that entity. She didn't know if she was dreaming or if this was really happening, but when she woke up, she was on the floor of her room, gasping, with her face covered in cold sweat. The room was in absolute silence. But she knew, deep down in her soul, that it was still there, watching her. And with each passing day, the feeling of being consumed grew stronger. Lucia began to lose moments of lucidity. Her hands trembled frequently. Her eyes were always filled with panic, and she murmured incomprehensible words. The emptiness was taking her. The abyss she had opened with the grimoire was swallowing her sanity, piece by piece. I tried to help her, but soon realized it was too late. The walls of her house began to distort, as if the house itself were reacting to the entity's presence. The shadows elongated unnaturally, and every now and then, we would hear a low, dragging sound coming from somewhere inside the house, as if something were crawling across the floor, getting closer. And it was there, in her living room, that I saw for the first time the true face of terror. The shadows began to move, but it wasn't a play of light. It was as if the shadows themselves took form, becoming denser, more real. And then, in the center of the room, a silhouette formed, and I saw, or rather, felt, the eyes of that thing looking at me. They were no longer whispers. They were no longer voices. It was a presence. I saw the eyes that should not exist, and felt deep within my soul, the terrifying truth, that thing was not something that could be banished or destroyed. It was part of Lucia now, part of her in a way that no one could understand. The thing she had invoked was inside her, and there was no longer any way to separate one from the other. Lucia, at that moment, was no longer a woman. She had gradually transformed into something that was at the mercy of what had touched her. I saw her for the last time on the night the house was found empty, with no signs of struggle, but with a tremendous stench of decay in the air. There were no more traces of Lucia, and no one knew what really happened. I know what happened, and I will never be able to forget. The grimoire is still there, hidden somewhere. Perhaps you will find it if you search hard enough. But believe me, you won't want to. I should have stayed away. I know that now. I saw what happened to Lucia, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that nothing else could go wrong, the truth is that that thing was closer than I imagined. Every word she said to me, every account, surrounded me like an invisible, suffocating web that could not be unraveled. I watched her lose herself, little by little, but it was in that moment, when my own life was at risk, that the truth hit me with all its force. I had been through something very similar on a trip to the countryside, but what happened to Lucia, that was far beyond. When I decided to return to her house, something inside me knew it wouldn't be the same anymore. The air was heavy, laden with an oppressive presence. The house, which once had a simple and cozy look, now felt like a nightmare prison, with the walls suppressing any remnants of life. Upon entering, the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, as if the very space were being distorted. The silence was deafening, yet at the same time there was something in the air that made me question whether it was truly silent, or if it was being flooded with sounds so low, so subtle, that I could barely perceive them. And there, in the corner of the room, I saw. Lucia was no longer alone. She stood there, motionless, her head tilted to the side. Her clothes were torn, and her body seemed more skeletal by the day. Her eyes were empty, lifeless, as if a part of her soul had been ripped away, left to rot in the darkness. And behind her, something I should have never seen. The shadow was thicker now, denser. I could swear I felt the claws of that thing touching my neck, its irregular, dragging breaths. It wasn't Lucia's eyes that were watching me, but the eyes of the entity through her. And then she spoke, but it wasn't her. "Now you also belong to me." The voice was like a muffled scream, a blend of something human and something not. And as those words were uttered, Lucia turned, but not in a natural way. She twisted her head at an impossible angle, bones cracking, and her eyes glowed as if they were absorbing all the darkness around her. The creature, now visible through her, smiled. Not with Lucia's lips, but with a mouth that should not exist. And the shadow, it was like the shadow of a colossal, deformed monster that was trying to materialize, dragging itself along the corners of the house. Each step made the walls tremble, and I felt something cold crawling up my spine. Lucia was no longer there. It was the entity she had brought, and she didn't just want to possess it. She wanted to take me too. Panic seized me instantly. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The air was compressed, dense, and I could barely breathe. At that moment, the only thing left to me was a terrible certainty. That grimoire, that damned book, hadn't just been a mistake of Lucia's. It had been an invitation. And I knew now, with absolute clarity, that it wasn't just her who was at risk. I heard the sound of something dragging behind me, and then, something cold touched the back of my neck. It was him. The house closed in around me. Whatever it was, the thing was taking shape, and I no longer knew where I ended and where it began. I escaped, but not in the way you might imagine. It wasn't a triumphant getaway, nor a golden solution. I lived to tell this story, but something in me, something remained. The grimoire is still there, I know it. It's waiting, watching, as always. And now, I know what it feels like to never be alone again. Because when you tamper with that, you don't break free. If one day, by accident or curiosity, you come across that book, remember, do not open it. Don't make the same mistake as Lucia. Because when you invoke what's between the shadows, it's not you who chooses when the end comes. And whoever invokes it will be the next victim. I didn't want to tell this. I swear I didn't. But he insisted, and somehow I knew that, upon hearing those words, my life would never be the same. The truth, I realized now, was a living entity, something that feeds on fear. And that fear has haunted me since the moment I heard his story. I worked in a small town in the countryside, an isolated place where shadows stretched longer than sunlight. The houses were old, with roofs falling apart, and walls that seemed to bend as if they carried the weight of a forgotten story. It was the kind of place where everyone knows too much about each other and hides from things they prefer not to remember. It was there, on that muggy late afternoon, that I met the man who would tell me the story that would change everything. He was sitting on a park bench, with the posture of someone who had seen hell and endured it in silence. His name was Marcos, and he had a vacant look, as if he were constantly somewhere else. The kind of look that makes you question what truly resides within someone. I saw him many times, passing by me, wandering aimlessly. But that afternoon, he approached me and, in a deep, drag-out voice, said something I have not been able to forget since. You need to know. There's no more time. I didn't know what he meant by that, but something in me knew that, upon hearing the story, my mind would never be able to return to what it was before. What he said next made me hesitate, but at the same time, something urged me to listen. You know about the black magic cult, right? He asked. I said no, that I didn't believe in such things. What he responded was so straightforward that chills ran up my spine. They don't ask for faith, just blood. He looked at me with a piercing gaze, as if trying to gauge the impact of his words. I didn't know, at that moment, that everything I knew about the world was about to disintegrate, like a house of cards being swept away by a cold, merciless wind. Marcos, without saying anything more, began to tell me the story. The beginning was vague, an emotionless explanation, but as he spoke, I realized he was relating everything, as if the words spilling from his mouth were not just a narration but a silent scream he could no longer ignore. I was one of the chosen ones. He took a deep breath, his expression growing darker. Have you heard of the village of Sauroke? It's in the countryside. Somewhere no one remembers anymore. We were called there, a select group. But the real reason was never told to us right away. They told us that power came from unity, from the strength of a pact. A pact with something beyond. Something that can't be seen but is felt in the depths of the soul. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I kept listening, feeling the weight of his words dragging toward me. They said the ritual was necessary. We were chosen to ensure power, longevity. But what they didn't tell us, what no one knew until that moment, was the price. The price that no one could pay. He paused, as if the memory were a poison still corroding his throat. The child. His voice broke, and he stared into the void. The child was the catalyst. A sacrifice. A pure sacrifice. She was brought to us, as part of the ritual. The story began to take shape, and Marcos's words started hammering in my mind, creating an image I couldn't erase. He spoke of an ancient cult, whose members sought power at any cost, in a god-forsaken village, and of a child, so pure, so innocent, who was taken from her family to feed the ambitions of men who had long lost their humanity. I didn't know what to think. The story seemed so absurd that, for a moment, I almost doubted Marcos's words. But then he told me something that sent chills down my spine. You will see what I saw. They don't leave. They stay. They won't let you forget. At that moment, a cold breeze swept through the square, and I felt, like an invisible presence, the weight of something watching me, waiting. I didn't know what he meant by that, but deep down inside me, I already knew this was more than just a story. It wasn't merely a horror tale. The child, he said. She was still there, waiting. What Marcos didn't tell me was that he was being watched. He was still being followed. And the fate of that child, what happened to her after the sacrifice, was not something you could simply leave behind. Marcos's story had begun. And with it my nightmare. I never imagined that the simple act of going out for coffee would change the course of my life. But it was in that cafe, in the most forgotten corner of the city, that everything started. I was waiting for my order when a man approached. He was no ordinary man. He had a dark aura, something that made me uncomfortable the moment our eyes met. His face was marked by time, his eyes were deep set, as if they carried secrets that couldn't be told. He sat at my table without asking for permission, as if he had already been invited somehow, and before I could say anything, he began to speak. I know what you're thinking. His hoarse voice cut through the silence of the cafe, and he smiled, but not with a friendly smile. It was a smile that seemed to know the darkest side of the human soul. You would never believe, but what I have to say will change everything. You have no choice. You will listen, because the truth is already in you. I remained silent, unsure how to react. The man didn't seem threatening, but his presence made my heart race, as if something was about to happen. He leaned forward, his trembling fingers touching the coffee cup, but his eyes never left mine. I lived in a place where shadows speak. He paused, as if weighing his words. where fear is not an emotion, but a constant presence that clings to you until nothing is left. I was one of the chosen. Part of something you would never understand until the night comes after you too. I wanted to get up and leave, but something held me back. Maybe it was his hypnotic gaze, or the tone of his voice that seemed to summon something I didn't know existed within me. Believe me, what I'm going to tell you is not a tale. It's not a horror story to frighten the curious. He took a deep breath. It's something that really happened. Something that is happening now, somewhere. And when you know this, it will no longer be possible to turn back. I was paralyzed, but the man, as if he knew my words were still trapped, continued. Do you know the story of a child sacrificed in the name of a dark power? Something that has long been hidden? No? Well, you should. You will see the faces, the place, and then you will understand what happened. You will understand why the child never rested. Because she is coming back. He stood up slowly, and before disappearing through the door, cast one last look at me, as if marking me with something invisible. A chill ran down my spine, and an indescribable shiver took over my body. The truth lies behind the shadows, and soon you will know who truly dwells there. You can no longer run. I was alone, but the weight of those words, of his gaze, stayed with me for days. And it was only when I began to see the first clues, the visions and the shadows moving, that I knew he had lied. His story had begun, and now so had mine. In the days that followed that encounter, a sense of unease settled within me. I couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. The mention of the child, the dark power, the shadows, something inside me knew this was not just a story, it was a warning. But what haunted me the most was the fact that, increasingly, I began to realize that the things around me were changing, as if reality itself was bending to that monstrous truth. At night, the silence in my house felt different. It wasn't the usual silence, the kind that offers us rest. It was a heavy silence, laden with something I couldn't identify. I felt the eyes of the shadows watching me, but when I looked into the corners, there was nothing there. The streetlight through the window seemed dimmer, and a dark mist formed around my house, as if it were being encircled. That was when everything began. I woke up in the middle of the night, with a muffled sound coming from the hallway. Someone was walking out there. I could hear the footsteps, faint and slow, as if the person were in no hurry. I dared not move. The footsteps continued, passing by my bedroom door and heading to the living room. Then, total silence. I quickly got up, my mind a storm of fear and doubt. But when I opened the door, there was nothing. Just the cold. My eyes fell on the floor. There were deep, irregular muddy footprints scattered throughout the house. But what made me freeze was the fact that the footprints didn't disappear. They began to move, as if something were crawling, dragging itself through the shadows. The sound of the footsteps was muffled but perfectly matched what I had heard. I followed them. They led me to the old attic. I knew I shouldn't go up, but something inside me couldn't ignore the urge. It was as if an invisible force was guiding me, pushing me toward that place. The stairs creaked as I climbed, and each step seemed to echo louder, as if the very air were trapped up there, waiting. When I reached the top, the door was ajar. I didn't remember leaving it that way. The wind blowing outside made the door move slowly, as if someone were pushing it from the inside. My heart raced uncontrollably, but I stepped inside. The sight that awaited me in the attic was so horrifying that, for a moment, I thought my mind was breaking. The shadows in the room seemed to form human figures, but they were distorted, as if they were twisting in a macabre dance. And among them, one figure stood out. A child. She was lying on the floor, her body twisted in an impossible way, her eyes completely white and fixed on me, as if she had known me for years, as if she knew what was about to happen. I couldn't look away. She seemed alive, but the silence emanating from her was suffocating, oppressive. The only sound was the cracking of her joints as she began to move, slowly, as if rising from a never-ending nightmare. I didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed me, but at the same time, I couldn't leave. The air was dense, heavy, as if the very space were being compressed by her presence. That was when, suddenly, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost inaudible, but it was clear, like a whisper that shouldn't be heard. You didn't let me go. Each word felt sharp, as if it were tearing at the skin of my soul. I was so terrified that I could hardly breathe. She didn't move physically, but her words, they were in my mind. Echoing, repeating. I could feel her suffering, her anger, the pain of something that had been done to her, and now she was back to claim. I tried to leave, but my feet wouldn't respond. I couldn't move. The air was so thick that I could no longer breathe, and when I looked at the shadows around me, I saw eyes. Eyes in every corner of the attic, fixed on me. I didn't know where they came from, but I knew they weren't human. They were the eyes of the creatures she had attracted. The shadows that fed on what she had become. And then she rose, but not in a normal way. She crawled, moving like a serpent, twisting her body in a grotesque and impossible manner, a monstrous smile spreading across her face. Her teeth, sharp and maddened, stood out in the darkness, and her skin was marked, as if being corroded from within by something nameless. She stopped right in front of me, and I could feel her presence, like an overwhelming force. Her eyes were fixed on mine, and for the first time in my life, I knew I was no longer alone. Whatever she was no longer a child. She was something more, something that should not have returned. Now you know, she whispered. Now you will pay. And, as a final blow, the attic lit up with a cold light, a light that came from no visible source but seemed to emanate from the very body of the child. The light blinded me, and all I heard was the sound of breaking bones and muffled screams. When I finally managed to escape the attic, what remained of me was only fear. The fear that that child, that presence, would never leave me in peace. She was coming back for me, and I could no longer run. She knew where I was, knew what I feared. What terrified me the most, however, was not the child herself. It was the fact that I felt a connection to her, something that shouldn't have been there. Something that, since that encounter, seemed to grow inside me. I can no longer hide. She is out there. And soon, she will come to get me. After that night in the attic, my life became a constant nightmare. The feeling of being watched never left me. In every corner of the house, every mirror, every window, there was something waiting to emerge from the darkness and reach me. And worse, I knew it wasn't a feeling of paranoia. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Something was happening. The child's visits became more frequent. Sometimes she manifested in the shadows, with her white, empty eyes staring at me from the depths of a dark hallway or reflecting in glass, as if trapped between worlds. I dared not close my eyes, not even for a second. I felt the weight of her presence, her muffled breath, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible. But I knew she was watching me. On the nights when I finally managed to fall asleep, the dreams were worse than the waking hours. I would wake up, sweating, with the child's scream echoing in my mind. But the most horrifying part was that, upon opening my eyes, I could swear she was there. In the corner of the room, at the foot of my bed, or lying beside me. I could feel the pressure on my skin, as if she were touching my body with her cold, broken hands. The worst happened one night, about 2 weeks after my encounter in the attic. I was in the kitchen, preparing something to eat, when I heard a noise coming from the living room. It was a soft sound, as if something was being dragged across the floor. I froze. I no longer had the courage to investigate, but an inexplicable force pushed me down that path. As I entered the living room, the scene before me was so surreal that, for a moment, I thought I was delirious. The couch was overturned, and in the center of the room was a mound of dirt, as if something was trying to emerge from the earth. The dirt was accumulating in an impossible way, as if the very ground was breathing. I approached, not understanding what was happening, but the scene revealed itself to be even more horrifying when the dirt began to move. A dirty, pale, skeletal hand slowly emerged, followed by a thin, deformed arm, as if it were struggling to free itself from an underground prison. My stomach turned, and fear paralyzed me for a second, but before I could react, a head appeared, the skin torn and decayed, the eyes white, empty, fixed on me. And then it spoke, in a raspy, trembling voice. I knew you would come. It was the same child, the same presence that haunted me. She was inside the house, inside me, and now nothing could save me. With a quick, inhuman movement, she stood up, her bones cracking with the effort. She approached slowly, unhurried, as if relishing my terror. Each of her steps was a nightmare, as if time itself was distorted by her presence. I backed up against the wall, but she didn't stop. She kept getting closer. "You can't escape anymore. You are part of me now," she whispered, and the words cut through my soul like sharp blades. I didn't know what to do. The air was heavy, unbearable. She was so close now that I could feel the coldness of her flesh, the dampness of her decayed skin, and for a moment, I believed I was going to be consumed by her. Consumed by darkness. Suddenly, a sound broke the tension. The front door slammed open, as if something had broken the latch. The child paused for a moment, looking at the door. Time seemed to slow down, and then, with a sudden movement, she vanished, disappearing into the shadows of the room. I didn't know what was happening, but a cold sensation took hold of me. Something was out of place. I knew that entity, that child, was not just a specter. She was alive in some way. She was present in the real world, through something I couldn't understand. My eyes fell on the open door. It was closed from the inside, but it seemed that someone, or something, had entered. Someone with dark intentions. When I looked down the hallway, I saw the reflection of a figure on the wall. A tall, thin shadow stretched and twisted, as if contorting itself to become a human form. But upon closer focus, I realized there was something much more than human. The outstretched hands, elongated fingers, and an aura of absolute malice that could not be ignored. I didn't know if it was the child or some other entity. But one thing became clear: she was not alone. Something else had arrived. And when that happens, there is no turning back. It was too late. She already knew where I was, what I feared. The approaching presence was not just a revenge from the past. It was something older, something I had awakened with my quest for truth. And now, the truth would come to find me. I didn't know what terrified me more that night, the fact that something was coming after me, or that I was already losing track of where the nightmare began and where reality ended. The shadow on the wall, that grotesque thing stretching and distorting like a reflection of a distant nightmare, seemed to watch me with cruel patience. I didn't know how to escape that place, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already trapped. I approached the door, but before I could touch it, the pressure in the air intensified. Something was getting closer. The sound of breathing not filled the space, something panting and inhuman made me freeze in place. The shadow had materialized behind me. I didn't dare look, but I knew it was there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Then, in a surge of desperation, I turned the doorknob and ran out into the street. The house seemed to twist around me, the sounds growing fainter, as if the world had become an endless void. But what made me stop was the scream, a horrible scream, filled with pain and despair. It came from inside the house, and I knew, it wasn't mine. It was hers. The child. I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. But when the scream abruptly stopped, the freezing silence was worse. What had happened inside the house? What or who had approached her? I didn't want to know. But when I looked back, I saw a light flickering in the window of the house. Something or someone was there, waiting. The figure of a child, skeletal and corrupted, with sunken, lifeless eyes appeared. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, the shadows began to gather. They moved sinuous, like a mass of decaying flesh. Rotten hands reached out, trying to grasp her, trying to pull her into the darkness. That was when the true terror began. The moment I looked at that child, feeling the weight of the inevitable, a cold hand touched my skin, and I could no longer scream. I couldn't move. She was with me, even outside the house. The entity was inside me, crawling into my soul. There was no salvation left. I realized that no matter what happened, the curse had been sealed. I was bound to that child, to the cult, and to the force I had tried to understand. Now, she claimed what was hers. I had been chosen. When the last shadow faded away, what remained was the void. Now, I am just an average between what was and what will come. But before you believe this has ended, remember this: I saw the darkness. And now, the darkness sees me. And it is waiting. It was a cold night, one of those that seemed to carry more than the simple weight of darkness. I was sitting at the kitchen table, stirring my cup of coffee, trying to shake off the fatigue. I work as a nurse in a clinic in the countryside, and I had always known that when dealing with rare and unusual diseases, the line between life and death is never clear. But what Dr. Felipe Alves told me that night, when he unexpectedly appeared at my door, would be more than I could bear. I had known him for years, but lately, he had become increasingly withdrawn, absorbed in something he never shared with me. Felipe was never a man of many words, but at that moment, his gaze, that strange, unsettling look I had never seen before, told me that something deeper, something disturbing, was happening with him. "You need to see this," he said, almost in a whisper. His voice, usually calm and controlled, was tense, laden with a nervousness I never imagined seeing in him. I knew he worked in a scientific research lab, but I never knew exactly what he was involved in. Sometimes, he talked about experimental substances, new treatments, or even theories about genetic manipulation, but always with a distance that seemed to conceal more than reveal. When I got into his car, the first thing I noticed was the smell. A strong, metallic scent, as if he had spent too much time among vials and experiments. It was the kind of smell you feel in pathology clinics, but denser, more invasive. Instead of making me question what he had been doing, it left me silent, waiting. The road seemed longer that night. The fog was thicker, and the further we got from the city, the darker the path became. Finally, we arrived at the lab, an isolated building at the end of an abandoned neighborhood, far from curious eyes. "Everything I discovered is here," he said, his voice trembling. I followed him to the main door, and as I crossed the threshold, a chill enveloped me. The lab was lit only by cold, white lights, but somehow, everything felt wrong. The walls were covered with notes, drawings, and formulas I could barely comprehend, but what truly gave me chills was what lay on the central table. On it, there was a small vial. It wasn't large or particularly impressive at first glance, but the dark liquid inside seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. Felipe approached it with a reverent care, as if he were handling something sacred. I found the key," he said, looking at me with wide eyes as if he had provided the answer to humanity's greatest mystery. "I found a way to bring back what we lost." I knew he was talking about his research, about rare diseases, about experimental treatments. But when he looked at me, a shiver ran down my spine, and a subtle sense of terror began to grow inside me. He told me about what he had discovered. An elixir. A medicine, if I can call it that, capable of reviving the dead. He believed that by bringing back those who had departed, he could not only save lives but also discover the answer to diseases that no one else could cure. But he wasn't just talking about life. He was talking about death. And in those words, I began to realize he was no longer discussing curing diseases. He was talking about the possibility of challenging something that no one should ever challenge, the very cycle of life and death. I brought one of them back," he said, and I felt the impact of those words like a punch to the stomach. And when he returned, he was not the same. It was at that moment, looking at the vial on the table, that I realized what lay before me was not science. It was not a discovery. It was a curse. But before I could say anything, Felipe did what I feared. He turned to the decomposing body on the table beside him. The corpse was covered by a tarp, but the outlines of the disfigured skin, the broken bones, were visible through the torn edges of the fabric. I wanted to stop, scream, run away, but something held me back. The vial was opened. The liquid was poured over the corpse, and at that exact moment, I knew that nothing could be undone. What happened next? I couldn't comprehend in words. The body moved. Not in a gentle or organic way, but grotesquely, as if it were being forced to move against its own nature. It was a sight of pure agony, as if death itself had been ripped from within it, but not with kindness, not with mercy. It was then, in that moment, that the true face of black alchemy revealed itself. And what Felipe did not know was that he had not just challenged death. He had, somehow, awakened something that should not have been awakened. Something that would soon begin to seek relentless vengeance. I was no longer in control. Felipe was no longer in control. No one was. You don't know me, but if you knew my story, you would probably walk around the block and never look at me the same way again. I was called Raphael, or rather, I was called. I am no longer who I was. I am something else now, a shadow of what I was, wandering through a distorted reality, an existence marked by the choices I made. It all started a few years ago, in a remote village in the countryside, where the air felt thicker and the shadows stretched like immortal fingers. I was just an ordinary man, frustrated with life, drowning in debt, and with a career that barely paid the bills. I needed something more, something to change everything. And that's how I found them. The cult had no name, or at least, not one that was given to me. The first time I heard about it was from a man I met in a dirty bar in the city center. He was a stranger, with dark eyes and a smile that seemed cynical, as if he knew something I didn't. He looked at me for a few seconds and then, with a slow, low voice, said, "You're looking for power, aren't you?" I regret to this day that I answered. But who wouldn't fall for that? I needed an escape, something to pull me out of this insignificant life, and what he offered seemed perfect. He spoke of a secret cult, a brotherhood that practiced black magic, ancient witchcraft capable of changing the fate of anyone willing to pay the price. Of course, I didn't believe in witchcraft or sorcery, but when he spoke of the rituals that could provide me with wealth, power, and the chance to finally take control of my own life, something inside me gave way. It was a mix of desperation and curiosity, enough to make me follow that man to a place I never imagined existed. He took me to a secluded house, an old building that looked more like an abandoned mansion, standing in the middle of a dense forest. The trees around the house seemed taller and darker, as if they were watching any movement that passed by. When I entered, I felt a shift in the air, a pressure pressing against my chest. There was something heavy there. The smell of incense and wet earth, mixed with the strong odor of something I couldn't identify. The men inside that house were not like me. They were silent, their eyes fixed on me, but without saying a word. I was led down to the basement, where the ritual would take place. There were no sweet words or promises of a better future. Just a vacant stare and a deafening silence that made my skin crawl. There, in the center of the basement, was an altar, surrounded by ancient symbols and handmade drawings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I knew I was in a place where the world I knew no longer existed. The air was thick, as if the house itself were alive, waiting for the realization of what would be done. The man who led me there approached me, his cold hands touching my forehead. He whispered something I couldn't understand, and then, suddenly, a piercing pain shot through my body. My muscles tightened and my heart raced as if it were about to explode. I wanted to scream, wanted to run away, but something held me back, an invisible force, something greater than I could comprehend at that moment. He grabbed my wrist and with a crooked smile said, "You have to offer something, Raphael. The price is always the same. What are you willing to lose?" I didn't know how to respond. What did I have? My debts? My life? What more could I lose if it wasn't what I had already lost over the years? But in that moment, the desire for power took over me, like a burning flame consuming me from within. I want wealth. I want power. I want everything I've ever dreamed of. "I'll pay the price, whatever it is," was all I could say. The man smiled, and suddenly, the altar began to glow with an intense red light. The shadows around the room seemed to shift, distorting, as if the very space was twisting around us. I heard a whisper coming from the back of the room, as if something was calling my name, and then, before I could react, the pain intensified. It was at that moment that I began to understand what was happening. The power I sought had a price, and that price was not something I was prepared to pay. It was not just money or status. It wasn't physical things. The power they spoke of was something far worse. Now, looking back, I see that everything that happened was a mistake, a nightmare turned real. But I also know that with every step I took, I went deeper into the darkness than anyone could. Imagine, the price of power is never paid only with what we have. It demands more, much more. I won't lie to you, the wealth, the power, and the luxuries I desired, they came. I received everything I asked for, but it was a bargain, an exchange that began to corrode everything I believed to be real. The strangest part was that the changes didn't happen immediately. In fact, there was a silent calm, as if magic had subtly infiltrated my life, weaving invisible threads and wrapping my soul with a cold touch. In the first few months, nothing seemed out of place. I paid my debts, bought new cars, invested in real estate and businesses. People looked at me with envy and admiration, as if I had something no one else had. I thought it was just the power of magic in action, but now I know it was the beginning of something much darker. That's when the first changes began to occur, and it became impossible to ignore them. I had always been a pragmatic man, but I started to notice strange things, small cracks in what had once seemed like a perfect life. Like a shadow, something followed my steps, something that was manifesting in ways I couldn't control. First, there were the nightmares. I tried to ignore them, but they were vivid, disturbing, and increasingly real. Every night, I woke up sweating, my body in shock, my heart racing wildly. I saw the same images, shadowy, distorted figures dancing around an altar, whispering words and languages I didn't understand. There was a face, the face of a woman, with no eyes but a grotesque mouth stretched to her ears, and she always called me by name, with a voice that seemed to cut through my insides. Raphael. Raphael. You forgot the price, didn't you? I would wake up, sit up, but the feeling that something was wrong never left me. I felt watched, pursued. As if something was always near, waiting to collect from me, like a silent creditor who knew the exact moment to demand its due. That's when things started to worsen. During one of my business trips, I returned home earlier than expected, and the house was strangely quiet. There was no one in the living room, and the house, which had always felt warm and luxurious, seemed empty. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger by the second. When I entered my office, I saw her. She was there, in my chair, her face still deformed from the lack of eyes, her mouth dilated and filled with a kind of black fluid that dripped from the corner of her mouth. Her hands were outstretched towards me, long, thin fingers almost translucent, like broken bones. She looked at me and whispered, "You have already paid, but now, let's see what else you are willing to give." The feeling of panic was indescribable. I didn't know if I was awake or still trapped in some kind of nightmare. The lights flickered and then the figure vanished, leaving in the air an unbearable smell of decay and incense. My body was trembling, my mind was about to explode, but the worst was yet to come. In the following days, the events became increasingly intense. I saw figures in the shadows, in the mirrors, heard whispers in the wind. When I tried to sleep, I felt the mattress sinking, as if something invisible was approaching me. Objects in my house began to move on their own. Books fell off shelves, doors slammed shut, clocks stopped and restarted randomly, as if time was distorted by the very presence of what I had summoned. I tried to deny it, tried to rationalize. I told myself I was going crazy, that it was all just a series of coincidences, but deep down, I knew the price was being paid. But I was not prepared for what would come next. It was on a rainy night, when I was alone at home, that the true pain began. I was sitting on my couch, trying to absorb everything that was happening, when I heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind me. The noise of something dragging slowly, as if someone were walking in the shadows. I went to the kitchen, but there was nothing. The house was empty. However, as I returned to the living room, I felt a pressure in the air, something that made my chest tighten. It was then that I saw something that couldn't be real. Marks began to appear on the walls. They were like deep claw marks, made by an invisible force, running from top to bottom, cutting through the paint and leaving a dark trail, like dried blood. And in the center of the wall, the symbol. The same symbol that was on the altar. The lions began to glow in a red hue, and I heard again the voice of the woman without eyes, now clearer, closer, whispering in my ear, "You paid with what you had, but the most expensive of all is still missing, your soul, Raphael. Your soul will be the final offering." Those words sank like knives into my brain. At that moment, I knew I could not escape. The cult I had sought, the magic I had invoked, were now taking hold of me. The price I had paid was not something that could be refunded. I had given more than I imagined. That night, I saw what remained of my humanity. I saw what happens when you play with forces beyond human understanding. And I know now that there is no escape. I no longer know what is real. As the days passed, Everything became a blur of nightmares and moments of lucidity interrupted by screams echoing in my mind. What I lived, or what I'm still living, no longer makes sense. Everything began to crumble the moment I realized there was no longer a clear line between the world I was in and the place where spells took form. The first thing I noticed was the change in the people around me. The cult, which once seemed like a powerful, almost religious organization, was infiltrating every aspect of my life. Some of my friends began to disappear, but more disturbing than that, their bodies started appearing in my house in ways that made no sense. At first, there were only traces, marks on the floor, torn clothes that appeared in the corner of the room. But then I began to see them, lying in the shadows, with empty eyes, their skin cracked like that of a corpse that no longer belonged to the world of the living. The first time I saw one of those bodies, I was heading to the kitchen in the middle of the night. The house was silent, but the smell of wet earth, something deep and rotten, lingered in the air. When I entered the room, I saw, with horrific clarity, the body of Marcos, one of my old friends, sprawled on the floor. He was deformed, as if he had been crushed, compressed from the inside out. His skin was discolored, and his hands were twisted, like claws trying to cling to what was left of his flesh. His eyes were open, but lifeless, and something was oozing from his mouth. It wasn't blood, but a black, viscous substance that spread slowly across the wooden floor. The room was cold, but that scene gave me an unbearable heat, a feeling of suffocation. And when I got closer, I heard a voice, a whisper, that came from Marcos's throat. Or rather, from what was left of him. You didn't heed the warnings, Raphael. You are no longer a man. I stepped back. The fear I felt was so palpable, so cruel, that I felt my throat tighten. Marcos's body moved slightly, as if trying to rise, but something even more grotesque happened. His skin began to tear, and I saw something writhing inside him. It was a creature, a thing, that twisted and stretched, as if trying to escape. But it couldn't get out. It was trapped. And then, with a low, cruel laugh, Marcos's body exploded. I don't know how else to explain it, but the sound was horrific. Flesh tearing, bone breaking, and that black liquid spreading throughout the room. I fell back, unable to tear my eyes away from what was happening. It wasn't just the flesh that was disintegrating, but his essence, everything he had been, being drained, taken by something invisible, a force that fed on that flesh. As if magic itself had taken control of everything and was delivering the final blow. It was no longer a body. It was an empty receptacle, a shell being sucked in by something beyond human comprehension. I ran to the room, locking the doors, desperate. My heart was beating in such an unbearable way that I thought it would explode inside my chest. But when I lay down, there she was again, the woman without eyes. I saw her through the window, in the darkness, her figure standing out against the night. Her mouth open, with the smile of someone who knew she had defeated me. She watched me with a coldness that seemed to pierce through everything, as if there was no longer a part of me that was worthy of salvation. And then, her voice, louder than ever, invaded my mind. You forgot your promise. Now you will pay with everyone around you. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was going insane, lost in a labyrinth of fear and death. What happened next makes no sense anymore. With each passing day, more bodies appeared. Not just of my friends, but of strangers as well. People I had never met, whom I had never seen before, but whose faces were now etched in my mind. And the most disturbing thing, I was starting to see those faces in my own reflections, in mirrors, in the car window, on my phone screen. They followed me, stared at me, watched me with their empty eyes and sometimes even moved. And there was something more, something I will never forget. The whispers, they began to intensify. Hissing voices, muffled screams, words intertwining and getting lost in the wind. The words, I didn't know what they meant, but they were clear. Clear as death. I tried to block them out, ignore them, but they came from all sides. The voices invaded me at night, whispering my name, invoking what I had already lost. I didn't want this anymore. I wanted it all to end. But I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, in a cycle without end. I had done something unthinkable, something irreversible. The magic I invoked was no longer under my control. It possessed me now, fed me, drained me until I was nothing more than a rotting memory of who I once was. And the worst part? It was spreading. I am writing this story, not because I want to, but because I know I have no choice left. They are coming, the creatures, the souls, the shadows. They are here. And I know the next victim will be you. Now, the question that won't leave my mind is, do you believe this is just a story? Or have you seen something you cannot explain? Because if you listen to this story until the end, it may be too late to realize that true black magic never ends. It continues, watching us, waiting. And I know you are the next piece on the board of this curse. Time passed in a way I can no longer measure. Each minute seemed to drag on, a torture of nightmares and hopelessness. When the shadows began to engulf my house, the walls grew damp with the smell of something unbearable, a mix of decay and burnt flesh, as if the very air was rotting with me. But the worst of all was the feeling of being watched, as if something had entered me, touched me, possessed me, and was controlling me without my awareness. I didn't know if I was still awake, or if I had already died. The cult, the magic, the rituals, they no longer made sense. Now, everything boiled down to a single thought: death. Not my own, but the death that the spells had brought into my life. That curse, that invisible force the cultists had invoked, it was taking over everything. On the last night, things reached a breaking point. The emptiness in the house became unbearable, a deafening silence, the sound of death dragging down the hallway, waiting for me to make the final mistake. The woman without eyes, who had never left me in peace, appeared one last time, standing in front of the door, shrouded in darkness. Her bones cracked with an eerie echo as she smiled at me, her teeth dirty and sharp as knives. "You forgot your promise, Raphael. The last soul has been harvested, now it's yours." She approached slowly, and with every step she took, the air grew heavier. It was as if life itself was leaving me, as if reality was beginning to crumble around me. The cries of lost souls, which had been muffled before, now rang loud in my ears, as if they were inside me. Each scream was a knife piercing my flesh. But the woman without eyes was not there to kill me. No, she was there to take me away. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The silence was absolute, impenetrable. Then, an unbearable pain pierced my chest, and I fell to the ground, my vision blurred. Something inside me seemed to snap. And at that moment I knew I was no longer alone. Something had taken hold of me, something that had already been inside me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was magic, the price of the spells I had invoked. They were in me, controlling me. The screams began again, but this time, they were no longer mere whispers. They were shouts of lost souls, of people I had sacrificed, whom I had condemned. And I knew that, in the end, there was no salvation left. The cult, the rituals, it was all beyond me. I had gone too deep. There was no turning back. Then, with one last gasp, my body convulsed. I saw my skin begin to unravel, as if being torn from the inside out, and what remained was a shadow, an empty flesh, a shell that would never be human again. The magic had consumed me completely. But the most terrifying part was what came next. The woman without eyes smiled, and around her, the world distorted. She took my hand, and in that moment, I saw what was truly happening. What I did not understand, what the cultists had known all along, was that true black magic was not just about power. It was about creating an eternal cycle, where the dead, the living, and the damned intertwined forever. I had not summoned a spirit or an entity. I had opened a portal. And now, that portal was open for all. And every soul that passed through it would be doomed to walk the same path I had walked. And every story, every tale of horror I shared with you, every word, is a warning. Because you are listening, aren't you? You are listening, and that means the cycle has already begun. You can no longer escape. Now your soul is already marked. I am no longer Raphael. I am just another echo, another shadow, a cursed memory of who I was. And you? You will be next. There is no escape. Now stop and think, what would you do if you knew you were about to lose yourself in a way you cannot comprehend? And what if you were hearing the last horror story of your life, without knowing that it has already begun to unfold? Death spells never end. They only begin, and you never know when you will be next. It was on a rainy afternoon that I met Marcos again, after years without contact. He looked exhausted, his eyes carrying a shadow that couldn't be ignored. When we sat down at the bar and he began to speak, the first thing I noticed was the nervousness in his voice. It was as if he was holding something very heavy inside him, something that, somehow, he could no longer hide. "Do you remember our childhood, right? Those trips to the country house, the cabin in the woods?" he started, as if trying to convince himself that what he was about to say wasn't as real as it seemed. Well, something happened there, and to this day I can't forget. I just can't. I knew he was referring to a group of friends who used to explore the outskirts of the city back then. They were young, eager for adventures, and never seemed to fear anything. And that cabin, that old house in the woods, had always been a place that called to us. But we never imagined something so dark was lurking, waiting for us to make the wrong choice. Marcos hesitated before continuing. He didn't want to relive that night, but he knew that, in some way, he could no longer escape it. Some friends, started getting interested in ancient rituals. Those things about black magic. And as always I went alone, not thinking about the consequences. That place, the cabin, it seemed perfect. It was away from everything. No one would interrupt us. And the idea of invoking something, feeling something we had never felt before was tempting, he said, shaking his head as if trying to push the memory from his mind. The story he began to tell no longer felt like a youthful adventure. It had become something much deeper, something I still didn't understand. They had found an ancient grimoire, long lost among the walls of the cabin. Marcos and his friends, upon opening the time-worn pages, discovered rituals that they never imagined could be real. I knew it wasn't a good idea, but everyone was so excited. So we did what was written. We began the ritual, thinking it would just be another night of fun, a game with the unknown. He spoke, and his gaze became distant, lost. But something wasn't right. He paused. The sound of the rain outside seemed louder, denser. When he finally looked back at me, his eyes were wide, as if the mere act of remembering what happened was enough to bring him back to that night. The air grew heavy, as if the place itself had changed, as if it was alive. The candles, the words we spoke. Suddenly, what should have been a harmless experience turned into something we couldn't control. And then it appeared. I was about to ask who he meant when Marcos stood up abruptly. His face was pale, and he seemed unable to continue sitting. "I can't count anymore. I can't. You'll think I'm crazy. But after that night, we all changed. And somehow, I know I never escaped it. None of us escaped." He slowly pulled away, and I stood there, heart racing, feeling a sense of helplessness and terror that I couldn't identify. What Marcos didn't know was that he had already dragged me into that story. And the moment he left, a thought haunted me. I already knew what would happen in the end, but I couldn't stop it. When Marcos was gone, I stood there, with a lump in my throat, trying to piece together his story. But something told me I shouldn't continue. Something in the way he looked at me before leaving, that unrestrained fear, made me question whether I had made the right choice in wanting to hear all of it. The feeling that he would pull me into something I couldn't control was almost palpable. Yet something inside me couldn't give up. I needed to know more. Something was driving me to go on. I went home, and in the quiet of the night, I picked up the phone. I texted Marcos, asking if he was okay. The reply came hours later, cold and emotionless. "You better forget this. Don't bring it up again," was all he said. But I couldn't. His story had lingered in my mind, like a persistent whisper, an invitation to the abyss. Whatever had happened in that cabin, I felt there was more to it, something buried beneath the surface of what he was telling me. Something that wasn't just about black magic, but about human nature itself, about the limits we shouldn't cross. I went back to that cabin. Something inside me was convinced that if I went there, I would uncover what really happened that night. No matter how much my mind tried to warn me, my body moved as if drawn by an invisible force. I arrived at the cabin the following weekend. The rain had stopped, but the atmosphere was still heavy, as if the air was saturated with the electricity of something unseen. The wind swayed the trees around, creating a low, constant sound, like the murmuring of something distant. The cabin, that old wooden structure, looked exactly as Marcos had described. But now, with the silence surrounding it, the feeling was different. The forest seemed to be watching. I entered, and the darkness engulfed me immediately. The smell of mildew and old wood was strong in the air. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I walked through the main room. The place was abandoned, but there was no dust, as if someone had cleaned there recently. Something was wrong. That's when I saw the grimoire. It was on the old wooden table, open, the pages worn by time. The book shouldn't have been there. Marcos told me that he had burned the grimoire after the ritual, that they had destroyed everything that reminded him of that nightmare. But the book was intact, exuding a presence that seemed to call to me. Its pages were marked with strange drawings, symbols, and words that seemed to move before my eyes. Without thinking, I picked up the book. The air in the cabin seemed to grow even denser, and a feeling of dread began to invade me. The sensation of being watched intensified, but I couldn't look away. Something held me there, preventing me from letting go of the book. It was as if the cabin itself was trapping my soul. I started to read aloud. What was written on the pages was indescribable, but something in the words sounded familiar, as if I had read it before, in some distant place. Each syllable that left my mouth seemed to warm the surroundings, as if the very ritual was being renewed, as if the presence of something ancient and evil was returning to the world. Then the sounds began. At first, it was a distant whisper. I thought it was the wind, but then the whispers became clearer and closer, as if several voices were speaking directly in my ear. Fear took hold of me, but my fingers continued to turn the pages, as if they were being controlled by something beyond my reach. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. I froze, my body in shock, as the sound slowly approached. It couldn't be. There was no one there. I knew that. There hadn't been anyone in that house for years. But as if something was digging through time, a presence began to descend the stairs, its footsteps echoing unevenly on the wooden floor, as if it were something crawling. I flipped the pages even faster, not thinking. The book was nearly at the end, but I didn't want to know what was coming. The air was cold now, and I could see my breath in small clouds. The sound of the stairs was now clear, and I knew I was not alone. When I looked at the door, the shadow appeared. It was a tall, indistinct figure, like a dark stain that didn't belong to reality. I couldn't see details, but something in its movement seemed erratic, as if it were trying to adjust itself to a human form but failing. Its arms stretched in impossible ways, and its body swayed back and forth, as if contorting in an insane motion. It was as if the figure itself was trying to materialize there, trying to become real, to feed off my presence. "You have awakened," the voice said, but it was not a human voice. It was a mix of sounds, as if multiple mouths were whispering together, in unison. Each word dragged through my mind, as if a million needles were piercing my consciousness. I ran for the door, but something held me back. It was no longer the book. It was the air, the very cabin, that seemed to want to devour me, to swallow my soul. Before I could react, I felt a cold, sticky hand close around my ankle. The force was indescribable. I tried to scream, but my throat felt like it was being torn apart, as if something was choking me. The pain was so intense that I thought I would faint, but somehow, I managed to free my leg and run. I burst out of the cabin, and a strong wind hit me, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave me. I looked back one last time and saw the eyes. Those red eyes, glowing in the darkness of the window. They were watching me, as if they already knew I had awakened the evil once more. I couldn't sleep that night. The fear was so deeply rooted in me that even when I closed my eyes, the images of the cabin and what I saw, or rather, what I felt, continued to haunt me. I could hear the whispers, the footsteps in the dark, the sound of something crawling. But more than the fear of seeing something again, it was the knowledge that there was something much greater and older behind it. Something that wanted to be unleashed, something that was trying to reach me from within. The next day, fear made me act impulsively. I went to the nearby town, the one I had never heard much about, but I knew that the old woman at the market always seemed to know everything. I went there in search of answers, not knowing exactly what I was looking for, but certain that I couldn't face what was pursuing me alone. The woman was behind the counter, as always, fiddling with something with her bony hands. When I approached, she didn't look directly at me, but I felt her presence become more intense, more palpable. Her eyes, almost blind from so much time alive, seemed to see right through me. She knew what I was looking for, even before I said a word. "You weren't there, didn't you?" she asked in a hoarse voice, as if she were tearing the words from her throat. I froze. How did she know? How could anyone know what happened in that cabin when I hadn't even told anyone? I didn't say a word, but she continued. "You awakened what should not be touched. That place, it's not a house, boy. It's not a lost refuge or a simple cabin. It's a tomb, a place where an ancient evil was trapped. And when someone tries to invoke, tries to reopen, it comes and takes over everything." Her words were not mere warnings. They were imbued with the feeling that if I didn't believe her, I might not come out of this situation alive. She leaned forward, her face pale and marked by thin veins, and stared closely at me, her hot, fetid breath piercing the air. "The cabin was built over a crypt. Not a common graveyard, but a prison. Those who tried to do what you did vanished. They became part of what was released. The entity, what you unleashed. It consumes the body and the soul, and what remains is a shadow, a grotesque copy of a human being. The pain, the suffering, that is eternal. There is no forgiveness for those who try to invoke it." She didn't need to say more. I already knew enough. The feeling of being watched returned with full force, as if every step I took was observed by invisible eyes, waiting for a chance to consume me. I knew that by hearing those words, I had already taken an irreversible step. The evil had already been unleashed. I returned home, feeling the weight of something invisible approaching me. The walls seemed to close in, and even the sounds of the city felt muffled, as if I were in another world. On the way back, the forest looked different, more oppressive, as if it were alive, reacting to my presence. The trees twisted, their shadows stretching unnaturally, wanting to swallow me whole. And then, that night came. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange noise coming from upstairs. It wasn't the usual sounds of the house, the wind, or the animals outside. It was something else. Something creeping. As if a body were slowly sliding down the hallway. I got up with a racing heart and a tight stomach. But when I stepped out of the room, what I found was even worse. The living room door was open, and the dim, distorted streetlight coming through the window illuminated a dark silhouette in the center of the room. But it wasn't a person. It wasn't a human being. It was a shadow, but with form. The figure seemed deformed, with stretched body contours, arms far too long and legs bent in an unnatural way, as if it had formed from something grotesque. I didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed me, and the shadow approached, as if analyzing me, making sure I wasn't a threat. There was no movement, just a presence that filled the entire space, something beyond my comprehension. Then, the thing made a sound. It wasn't a scream, nor a word. It was more like a deep whisper, a vibration that seemed to come from within my own body. Every cell in me wanted to flee, but I couldn't move. The sound grew louder, more shrill. It was as if something were tearing my soul from the inside out. That's when my vision began to distort. The walls of the room started closing in, and the shadow stretched, as if it were dominating everything around it. But the worst was what happened next. The body of the thing began to change. Its eyes, the lead eyes I had seen before, in my escape from the cabin, started to appear on its body. Suddenly, it was no longer a shadow, but a multiplicity of bodies, distorted, deformed, with familiar faces, faces of my friends, my acquaintances, people I loved. They were all there, but twisted, with contorted bodies, empty eyes, as if they were being consumed from the inside out. And what made me completely lose control was the laughter. It wasn't a human laugh. It was a laugh of many mixed voices, a laugh of something that should never exist, feeding on the suffering and anguish of the living. I knew what that was. I knew I could no longer escape. What Marcos and I had awakened in that cabin, what he had left behind, was now inside me. He was not the only one. We were all just pieces in an eternal game, where the evil that had been unleashed would never die. That night I felt the weight of all the terror that pursued us. Something much greater than me had been invoked. Something beyond our understanding was now in my body. I didn't know how, but I felt this presence inside me, corroding my being, possessing every thought, every fragment of humanity that remained. I was an empty shell, a walking shadow, with the red eyes of those who had been consumed by the entity. The laughter, oh, that laughter. It never stopped. I heard it in my mind, reverberating, coming from my own vocal cords, but with a tone that was not mine. The walls of my house began to distort, as if the space around was being pulled into an endless abyss. I tried to scream, I tried to fight, but the body wouldn't respond. I was weak, exhausted, as if being drained from within. That was when I looked into the mirror. The reflection was no longer mine. What looked back at me was a deformed being, with pale skin, empty red eyes, and an expression of pure despair. But it wasn't just my face. It was the face of everyone who had entered that cursed place. With every second, I saw the reflection of Marcos, of other friends, even the faces of those who hadn't known what had happened there. They were all there, reflected in me, as if they were part of the same body. "You will be like us now," whispered the voice in my head. "Soulless, willless, just a puppet in the hands of whoever freed you." I tried to resist, but there was nothing human left in me. I had become a part of what I had unleashed. A fragment of that ancient thing, that entity that now fed on my memories, my fears, everything I had ever been. There was no more time. There was no more salvation. I knew the worst was yet to come. The evil, whatever it was, would not stop there. It had an insatiable hunger. And as I looked into the mirror, with those red eyes reflecting my own downfall, I realized that the entity had not finished consuming me. No, it was just beginning. What it wanted from me was my soul, my essence. With one last gasp of lucidity, I saw what I should never have seen. Marcos was there, beside me, with the same empty gaze, the same expression of horror. He was already consumed. He was just another extension of that which had no end. I screamed, a scream so deep, so desperate, it felt like my own throat would tear apart. But nothing happened. I felt no relief. I only felt the darkness. And when it was all over, I was no longer myself. The last words you just heard are the truth I never wanted to share. The cabin, the ritual, what we unleashed, it didn't end with my fall. It didn't end with Marcos. What happened to us, what took us, never stops expanding. And now, we are no longer the only ones. I can feel them around me, lurking, waiting for new bodies. The hunger never ends. But perhaps you've already noticed. I am just a story, just another echo of what was awakened. But what about you? How many of you have felt a presence, a shadow creeping in the darkness? Has your soul been touched as well? Don't be fooled. The evil we unleashed is still out there, and it will seek more. It is looking for you. And maybe in the end, the real question is, how far are you willing to go to keep your soul intact? Did you like this story? Then like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. But be careful, now one knows you listened. Have a scary story? Send it to the email in the description. See you next time, if you're still here.